Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Youth Today, the show where we dive deep into issues that matter to young people. Today, we'll be talking about rhetoric and political literacy, and we'll be talking to Evie, a youth MP for Surrey. So, Evie, can you tell me a bit about your role and the work you've been doing so far?
Yes, of course. So I am a youth MP for Surrey, which means that I represent about 20,000 young people in the county of Surrey, and we hear young people's voices and then we take those issues that really matter to them to our local authorities and then obviously up to the government. We meet as a whole collective of youth MPs like once or twice a year, as well as in smaller groups called youth cons, and then we take those recommendations to say areas, the government, counties, what have you, and try and implement them.
Can you tell me what issues you campaigned for during your elections and a bit about them?
Yeah, okay, so the issues that I initially campaigned on were the environment. I wanted sort of more awareness of how big corporations were sort of impacting environmental justice, and that also kind of links in a little bit to something else that I was really, really passionate about with my campaign, which was, as we're going to talk about today, rhetoric and political education, because I just think it is so important that young people are fully armed with all of the tools that they need to be able to move in like today's society that is so heavily dependent on. We're going to talk about it later about social media and the way you communicate things.
Can you tell us why it's important to analyze rhetoric?
Yeah. Okay. So rhetoric is basically the way we communicate things. It's this broad collection of techniques, tactics, all these different things that we use to communicate things and get the outcomes that we want. So, for example, if you were a politician, you'd use a wide range of rhetorical techniques to connect with your audience, to get the outcomes that you want out of your campaigns, your speeches, whatever it is you're doing. You're wanting to elicit that specific thing and you're going to use those techniques. We learned about it a little bit in school. You may have heard of a forest, which was at least what I was taught, which includes things like repetition, emotive language, metaphor, simile. All of these things are a part of rhetoric. And the reason it's so important to analyze it is because, as I said, it's designed to elicit specific outcomes, responses, all these different things. And we have to be aware of when we are being encouraged to do a certain thing or when we're encouraging others to do a certain thing and how we're doing it. Because whether or not you agree with what you're being encouraged to do, it's important that you're aware of how you're being encouraged and how to use those techniques for your empowerment.
Can you maybe tell us some the common rhetoric techniques that politicians use, or some of the most compelling ones? Is there any that strikes you in particular?
Yeah, so, oops, sorry, yeah. A pretty common one is repetition to build up the impact and profile of a specific issue, a specific phrase that they want to stick, and they may repeat it over the course of a paragraph, they may repeat it over the course of a sentence, even over a whole campaign, but they will be repeating it to really make sure that it sticks in your mind and that when you think of that politician, you really associate them with that issue. And another is, I mean, it overlaps a bit with debate techniques, which are a kind of different ball game, but they're kind of related.
Okay,
So
thank
I'm
you.
trying to think what other
Yeah,
rhetorical
I think you
techniques.
see lots of public speakers and politicians and everyone online when they have a point they really want to say, they always kind of repeat it in your face. But it definitely makes you remember it, so I do think it's definitely very powerful. And do you think these kind of techniques are the same in social media? Or do you think, or maybe do people on social media, do they use different techniques? And also, when politicians use social media, has it changed the way that they use it to influence young people? Do they change the way they do it, basically, on social media?
Yes, social media has had a huge impact on today's rhetorical landscape, on how politicians interact with their audiences, on even just how they use their techniques and things. So social media is, we've seen a lot of discourse about this. Social media is very dopamine based. It's very driven towards catching your attention in the smallest amount of time possible and then grabbing you for however long that they want. And so politicians have had to adapt their techniques to being very attention grabbing, very polarizing. You want engagement, you need discourse in order to stay thought of and stay relevant in the public discourse. So, and while this can be important, politicians are innovating, finding new ways to talk to young people, especially because young people are often the biggest demographics on social media. They're often the ones that are ahead of the trends. Often young people, especially young women, are the ones pioneering new developments in language, in politics, political movements, social thought. It can also have a dark side, and that dark side is stochastic terrorism, which is something I am very keen to make sure that people are aware of, because it is so common. My experience, at least, is when you start seeing it and start seeing the sort of facets that help support it, you can't unsee them, which is an interesting effect.
So can you maybe explain basically to the audience a bit more about stochastic terrorism, just a little bit more, maybe just explain briefly what it is?
So basically what it is it's when a public figure uses public mass media in order to incite a hatred or social discontent against a particular person or group of people. But the key is that they do it in a way where it is just shy of prosecutable hate speech laws, incitement to violence laws, those sorts of things you're imagining. Two, they always do it using these rhetorical techniques, these debate techniques, including and not limited to emotive language, painting the other side in a very particular light that is going to encourage followers of that public figure to see the other side in a dehumanized light. And also dog whistles. Dog whistles are a huge thing. Dog whistles are, for those who are unfamiliar, coded language that's used to communicate a message, a subtextual message that won't always be apparent to those just hearing the sort of surface level versions of the phrase. I'm trying to think of some examples that aren't going to be very controversial. Obviously, because of the nature of these sorts of discussions, you do end up sort of butting up against these very controversial issues. I'm just trying to think of some common dog whistles. Okay, yeah, some dog whistles. Let's say that, for example, were there popular public politicians who were describing, for example, immigrants in this sort of very dehumanized, very polarized light, calling them sort of aliens, illegals, all this sort of language that we're probably very familiar with it. You can probably think of other examples, but the subtext there, they're not just calling immigrants aliens, though that is their legal status. They're not just calling them illegal migrants, that is a legal status, but there's a subtext to it. There's a subtext to it that's going to encourage followers of certain politicians to de-empathize with immigrants.
Yeah.
And the real crux of stochastic terror is that it incites, it raises the likelihood that a violent act is going to happen against a personal group of people, but it is indirectly. It cannot be linked back to the stochastic terrorist. It just raises the likelihood that a violent act is going to happen. So, for example, let's say that someone very, very famous did a hugely well-shared speech, slandering, that's a legal term, sorry, really, really painting a personal group of people in a very cruel light, and then 6 months later, something terrible happened. I'm going to give the example of the Southport riots. I am not going to get into whether or not certain politicians or certain public figures were or weren't an inciting factor. But I will say that the language that we see in this common discourse is quite inflammatory, and I would class definitely some of it as stochastic terror, specifically because of that statistical factor of the statistical likelihood being raised as an indirect consequence of the language and the rhetoric that we are seeing.
And do you think then this is amplified by social media? Because lots of people have access to it, I mean, across the country. I mean, if they, if politicians make a speech to a group of people, how far can it spread? But when it's like, when there's hate speech kind of is accessible all around social media, do you think that amplifies their hate a bit more and it can cause more harm then?
I think social media does have a huge amplifying effect. I mean, obviously, the much more prevalent access that people have to it is obviously going to be something that we consider. It's, ever easier to get on social media, and it's ever more necessary to be on social media in our society. So, yeah, and it's hugely amplifying. A small group of people can very easily turn into a much larger group of people, all with this potentially more extreme sort of, and again, social media, again, it feeds into those more and more extreme views, partly because of that attention grabbing aspect, partly because of the algorithm aspect. If you get, one piece of content, you're going to be linked to other more content, and it's going to push you down that pipeline of
Yeah.
the extremism, radicalization.
Mm.
And yeah, it's really concerning that we have obviously that potential that this sort of smaller, more insular groups of people can very easily become much bigger. And also, I was trying to think of something else about the amplification of it. Nuance. It raises nuance a lot of the time because these are really complicated political discussions that a lot of the time we're having on these platforms that are maybe 240 character limits. TikTok comments, a 180 character limit. You really cannot get a nuanced and balanced perspective in that you're forced to go with your most headline points, your most controversy inducing bones of your argument. So it does absolutely have that amplifying effect. And obviously, then once you've got that amplification, it kind of forces politicians to engage with it in a way that they may not necessarily want to. I mean, look at the way that sort of we see people being, especially political figures, being sort of pressured into maybe engaging in things when they've not been given enough time to prepare their sort of
Yeah.
opinion on certain issues,
Yeah.
sort of forced to agree with a side that's more dominant, more sort of pushy, if you like, more pushy.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's got negative consequences for both figures and followers.
Yeah, and I guess at the end it can also affect their voting habits and how they think, and if there's these very the way that some figures use social media and for hate, is there any way you think that we can prevent this? Do you think political literacy would be a good idea to prevent this kind of behavior, or at least people falling into these traps, you could say, of becoming vulnerable to these radicalized speech and posts?
I think that there are absolutely ways to prevent it. I mean, even the most sort of extreme person that you may see, there's always a way out. It just involves being open to other perspectives. It involves sort of following even those sort of tiny little lifelines out of these echo chambers that are often so filled with hate. It's really sad. It's really sad often. You just see these, and especially young people. Young people are spending time on social media. There's a lot of pressure in a young person's life, just from sort of a myriad of factors. And that's how you often see, and also the algorithms that I mentioned previously, that's how you often see those people falling down these pipelines. But again, like there is absolutely ways to prevent it. And the sort of biggest thing that I will always advocate for is, again, political literacy. And I think a huge part of that is trusting young people with more intense topics, more intense sort of things. Obviously, having these sort of things, these topics introduced to them in a, safe, age appropriate way But I also think that a lot of the time we sort of mollycoddle, if you like, young people into thinking, oh, you're young, you'll never be able to handle this topic in a mature manner, never be able to actually understand the sort of real world details of certain things.
Yeah, especially with votes at 16, when like the Labour government announced that 16-year-olds could vote in the general election. I feel like there was kind of a sense of a lack of confidence in young people themselves. I mean, I think political literacy might solve that, but at the same time, I mean, this is my personal opinion. I think that lots of young people are also told that they're kind of not mature enough to understand these topics, or you're made to believe that will always fall trap to misinformation. But at the same time, adults can't, which is obviously false, right? I mean, if you look at social media, it's not just young people falling into these traps or getting easily influenced. It's also older people getting influenced by these public figures. I mean, I guess putting political literacy in a school setting, for example, it might solve the root cause of the problem in a way. Like, you're going to, in the long term, you have a generation which is more informed and will be able to make better decisions. But I feel like there's still, the adults who still fall into these traps. I mean, what else is there anything we can do for them? Do you think social media, the way the companies use algorithms, do you think they should regulate how they distribute content to the older generation?
I definitely agree with you that there was an atmosphere of disbelief in young people during that sort of discussion that we were having around 16-year-olds having political literacy. Again, like you point out about the long term benefits of giving young people electoral enfranchisement, because while it may be sort of difficult to get the sort of groundwork in, if you like, I've seen definitely some people saying that, it's going to be too difficult to get young people engaged, to get young people educated. But once you've got that framework in schools, in colleges, in these places where young people are going to be frequenting, you've got it. There's nothing stopping you from building it up and up as you go. And then you've just got increasingly educated young people that are just going to be more and more confident to engage in society, to engage the way that older people often tell us that we're not ready to.
Yeah.
Cheers. Good always.
Do you think then political literacy, let's say it was to be implemented in schools, do you think that, youth clubs and youth centers that we're a part of, do you think that they should also implement like a kind of program for political literacy? Because, not obviously all kids go to school or go to an educational institution. So what do you think?
I think that while they wouldn't necessarily have a sort of defined curriculum, as you may expect a school or college or sort of higher education to offer, you can definitely sort of give them guidelines on how they can support and foster a culture of political awareness, of all of these sort of ground rules of good faith political discussion. There's a very fine art, if you like, to understanding when a discussion is going to be valuable to have, whether or not it's in good faith, how you can conduct those arguments, even if you're handling really sensitive topics, how you can conduct those arguments in a way that is respectful to both parties, that doesn't put vulnerable people in harm's way. These sort of fine arts that definitely can be taught and can be built up through a culture of supporting it.
Do you think then that currently, right now, around the news as well, as of now, people say that young people are not really engaged in democracy or decision making around them. Do you agree with that, or do you think that young people do have a passion inside them that could be fostered, I guess?
I think the young people have always had a drive for autonomy. We see this in a lot of the issues that we may even write off as just classic teenage rebellion. What that is just asserting a desire for autonomy. Like, if you think about it, what all a young person wants is to be heard. That's why you see that stereotype of teenagers having arguments with their parents. They want to be heard. They want to be listened to. And currently, a lot of adults that are in power will tell us, you are too immature. You cannot possibly handle this discussion. You're just going to vote for your favourite pop star. But no, if you give us the chance to be aware, if you give us the chance to be educated, if you give us that chance to discover the beauty of politics on our own terms, then we can really have these valuable contributions that are just overlooked in the name of just age discrimination, essentially.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, especially when you go into any setting, I feel like young people are very opinionated. I mean, to say that they're not, even reading the news, you could say counts as like being engaged in the political landscape around you, right? It's not just they're completely just unengaged as well. So, do you think then votes at 16, do you think that will probably help build that voting habit in young people? Do you think there could be a higher turnout in the next elections because young people are now voting, or they'll have to build the habit too?
Yeah, I think that giving us that chance to have the vote at 16, there's two sides to it. On one side, you obviously have we can do a lot of other things. We can work. So, we can sign up to the military in some capacity. We can, I believe it's Scotland. I think you can get married with your parents' permission. These sort of introductions to these aspects of adult life that are given to us in a age appropriate manner. And I think voting is no different. If you let us have that chance, if you let us prepare to vote in an age appropriate way, we perhaps go with our friends, maybe we go with a parent to see the
Yeah.
process of voting, to engage with it ourselves, and you know, then it will probably increase voter turnout. Getting those habits in early, getting it associated in the minds of young people with freedom, independence, seeing the policies and aspects of your life that you wanted to see from the government being implemented, and knowing that you had a part to play in that as a voting citizen. Also, the other sort of note that I wanted to say is that we have, I think it's 54% of adults are that are eligible to say in the UK are either like eligible and not registered, or they're kind of registered and not voting. We end
Yeah.
up with only sort of I think it is 54% that end up sort of actually in that voting block,
Wow.
which means I could be getting my statistics wrong.
Okay.
Again, I'm just going off the top of my head here what I can remember. If I find that it's wrong, I would obviously correct that. But yeah, it points to a sort of larger issue of not everyone is registered, not everyone is eligible, not everyone wants to be either of those things. So that does have a big impact on our electoral politics. Say, for example, Brexit. This is the example
Yeah.
that I was introduced to, that whole statistic of 50%, whatever it may be.
Yeah.
If you only have a slim majority of UK adults that are voting, imagine how many of those could tip a crucial vote when it isn't the majority of the population. That is something
Oh,
important to
yeah.
consider.
Yeah, that would be. I mean, I was quite shocked. I mean, obviously, we don't know for sure 54%, but I'm sure it's somewhere around that. That's quite that's quite small to compared to what I thought. So then, I guess if we somehow encourage young people, do you think that, or like implementing political literacy, then you do think that will probably majorly increase? If people are more confident to vote, do you think that will increase voter turnout from 54% to something hopefully larger?
Yeah, I think it will increase voter turnout. Again, that's sort of what I was saying about getting voting habits entrenched, getting them to sort of regularly vote, to be registered, to understand the sort of procedures of registering, when you have to re-register, when you have to like do certain documents, and again, sort of learning to identify voting misinformation. A lot of the time, it may seem like benign misinformation, like, oh, if you do this, that ruins the balance. If you do that, that's correct voting technique procedure. But if you don't vote properly, your vote isn't counted. So if you're
Hmm.
not exerting that right to vote in the right
Yeah.
way, you're not using it at all.
The last question I have for you is, so if we were to implement political literacy and somehow increase the voter turnout, what would you like it to look like? Or how do you think the government should implement it? What would it look like to you?
I think that it should start small and then build up the further up you go. The way we do it for PSHE, year sevens are not taught in the same way that a year 13 would be. So we would obviously start small and then build it up and start with the most pressing issues, the issues that are most likely to affect young people and the things that are going to have the most impact on a young person if they aren't taught timely, effectively, again, that's that thing of radicalization, how you can get out again if you are caught in that cycle, and the ways that you can safeguard yourself and others against that very prevalent pull that we see towards more extreme positions and worldviews.
Just last thing, how do you think then would be the best way to keep it kind of non-partisan? Because obviously we have to respect everyone's views as well. Do you think is there an easier way around it? How do you think is a good way to go about this?
In terms of being non-partisan, I think that you can definitely champion the core values of compassionate discussion, protecting vulnerable people in more intense discussions, and obviously the political chess games that get played using real people's lives also the time. Side note on that whole culture war idea, it's so dehumanizing to so many people. And that simple truth that everyone deserves to be valued, no matter where they come from, they shouldn't be exposed to this political vitriol that is just normalized and being aimed at various people. And that's not a partisan concern. A person from one party can just as much learn and respect good debate and persuasive technique as a person from another party. And the two can absolutely have a sensible, normal discussion that doesn't cause undue harm.
I completely agree. I think that you're right. If we can somehow create meaningful discussions and respectful discussions between people with different opinions, I think it would be better for our society. So I guess that wraps up our episode then. Thank you, Evie, for the really wonderful discussion we've had today. I really enjoyed it.
It's a pleasure.
I definitely learned a lot as well. And I guess that also wraps up our episode for you today. So I hope you've all enjoyed,